2 weeks have been some important things happening in Israel. Do they know what they are? Okay.
I don't follow it. The news.
I don't want to steal your thunder.
Two annual observances. One is Independence Day. It's the 73rd anniversary of the birth of the nation of Israel. And the other was Holocaust Remembrance Day. On Independence Day, Hamas helped them celebrate by shooting a rocket at them. And it landed in Israel, but nobody was injured. It's almost a routine thing now, and the fact that there's only one is
That's unusual.
kind of unusual. Yeah. I was in Tel Aviv one time, and a rocket landed and exploded about 20 miles from where I was, and it was a non-event. People were down at the beach swimming and just going about their daily business. Just something that happens. That was Independence Day. During Holocaust Remembrance Day, the sirens blow all over Israel, and people stop whatever they're doing. If they're driving down the road in the car, they stop in the middle of the road, get out of the car, and stand and observe a time of silence in remembrance of those who perished in the Holocaust. Since Israel has been in the news lately a lot, had it on this morning, talking about Israel and Iran are shooting at each other even now as we speak, and things that are happening. I thought maybe we could take a little bit of time out of our study of Revelation and look at the modern state of Israel and what is happening and how it got there, and help us to relate not only current events to what is happening, but also Revelation to what is the situation in Israel. So I want to go back and just briefly go through the formation of the country of Israel that we deal with today. Some of you that were in the Sunday school class a couple of years ago, you'll see some slides that you think are familiar, but it doesn't really hurt, I don't think, to review once in a while where we are and where Israel is. Here is a modern map of Israel, and you can see the light-colored part is considered Israel today by them and by the United Nations and by the world. On the right-hand side of the river, the Jordan River runs right down through the middle of the picture there, is the country of Jordan, and in the northern part of that strip is the country of Syria. Both Jordan and Syria border Israel on the east. North of Israel is Lebanon, and south of Israel is Egypt. They're bordered by potentially enemy countries all the way around. The kidney-shaped part there in the middle of the picture is what we refer to as the West Bank, and this, along with the Gaza Strip, the little brown strip in the southwest corner of Israel, next to the sea, those two comprise what the world regards as Palestinian territories that Israel occupies. According to the United Nations, they have they have really no legitimate claim to their own country, basically. Okay, here is a map. This is one guy's idea. The red line is the Mosaic covenant. What God told Moses he could have if they would claim it. And if you look at the book of Genesis or the book of Exodus, you'll see that that is pretty much lined up. You can see the upper right part of the red line is the Euphrates River, and that's named as one border. Down to the left, at the bottom, in Egypt, is the Nile River, and that is named as another border. And then they think pretty closely the two towns that make the ends of the straight line, which would be sort of the southeast border. Those are the location of those towns, although they don't exist today. But and then if you look at the dark brown spot over there, that is what they have today. Israel has never claimed all the land that God gave them. No. And that which they claimed, they didn't completely wipe out the enemies anyway. You read the Old Testament, the Philistines were in theirs, and there were different Canaanite groups. Yeah, Missy? Hello, by the way. Good to see you.
I was wondering, Euphrates River, the borders Israel. What's on the other side of the Euphrates? I mean, what is the borders Israel and what else?
Oh, okay. On the Euphrates River goes right through the middle of Iraq.
Oh, Iraq.
That's Iraq on both sides of the Euphrates River.
On both sides.
You need a pointer.
Yeah, I really do.
Got a laser pointer?
I've got a laser. I do. Well, there we go. Okay, there's the Euphrates River. This green is the country of Iraq. This dark green is the country of Syria. Okay, this is Jordan, this army green. Lebanon is this blue, and Israel is this brown. This is Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, Iraq. Israel is pretty much boxed in and surrounded by those countries.
So when you talk about the West Bank, it should be the West Bank of the Euphrates, not the West Bank of the...
Well, yeah, if you were going to be accurate, but today they recognize just this light blue. It looks like it's part of the ocean, but it's not. It's the West Bank. Now, how did we get to this spot? This is the interesting part, I think. Here is a map of Israel before World War II, and before the agreement which created the country. This was not a country. They had been put under French control in World War I. This was put under British control after World War I, and remained that way until Israel became a country in 1948. This is Transjordan, meaning across the Jordan River, and this is Palestine, which there is no really no historical country of Palestine. It just doesn't exist. But this is what at the end of World War I, the countries that defeated the Muslims, the Ottoman Empire, headquartered in Turkey, controlled all of it. They took it and divided it up the way they wanted. They created the country of Iraq. It didn't exist. Iran or Persia has been there all this time, but they just made arbitrary boundaries and said this is what it's going to be, which is the source of a lot of the world problems that has been ever since. Is that you're a country and here's your borders, and they said, well, no, we're not part of the same country, as the Muslims, we are Turkish Kurds, so we shouldn't be in Iraq, and we should, but that didn't matter. They were just divided up. Okay, then at the end of World War II, the United States nations decided to give the Jews their own country. So they carved out, I'll show you now in a few minutes, a area of Palestine. Now, at this time, there were Jews and Arabs living in this entire thing. What they did, they said, we're going to cut out a little strip of land here and give it to the Jews, and we'll give the rest to the Arabs. Okay? So that kind of created the country of Jordan, and that included the West Bank that we were just talking about. I'll show you the map again. Okay, during the time that the British controlled all this, between World War I and World War II, they did not allow Jews to come in. However, they did. They snuck in, and especially then when World War II was over, there is a time in there when they saw an opportunity and they just mobbed the British and came in anyway. So does that show up enough to see it? So anyway, they started returning to what they considered their homeland. The United Nations got together and created the modern state of Israel, and this is what they came up with. Here on this is right now, everything that's colored is what's recognized as Israel today. They gave Israel this dark part. Now, this was just like 6 miles width here, no width here. Can you imagine militarily trying to defend a country with borders like that? But what they gave them was really just scraps off the table and left them very vulnerable to attack by all of these countries: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, all of these countries that were enemies.
You know, it's almost like they did that on purpose so they would fail.
It is, isn't it?
I mean, like you said, militarily speaking, and I'm sorry, that's the way I go too, you know.
It was ridiculous. And where they came up with all these, I haven't read into the whole thing. This Gaza Strip and this here belonged to Egypt, and this belonged to, according to them, Jordan. And much of the problem we read about right now is who owns this. Many Israeli citizens have moved in and bought land, built houses. The settlements, that's a word you see in the news quite a bit, which is a big obstacle to peace talks, occur primarily in what we call the West Bank. When you go into, now the borders are going to change from this, by the way. We'll show you a modern, up-to-date map. But this is what they were given. Israel said, we'll take it. Okay. The Jews said they'll take it. The Arabs said, we're going to do away with that new country before it even gets started. So the countries of the world then had to decide if they were going to accept this division and accept the UN giving Israel its its own country, giving the Jews their own country. And so it was a big thing. Harry Truman was president of the United States then, and he was really boxed in as to whether he, as the head of state of the most powerful country in the world, should recognize Israel or not. Harry Truman wanted to. He had enough of a Southern Baptist background that he understood the importance of supporting Israel. But his cabinet and his Secretary of State were against it. In fact, he was told by the leaders of his own government, if you recognize the new state of Israel, we'll never vote for you for anything again. So those are the pressures that this man was under. Fortunately, he made the decision to go ahead and recognize Israel. So the UN proposed this. The Israeli cabinet met. They had already formed a government of sorts. They already had an underground army going. They had stockpiled weapons, which kept a secret from the British, because the British didn't want them to have anything. They formed what they called the Haganah, which is the army of the time, and they were ready to defend themselves, they thought, or hoped. They couldn't find any country in the world that would sell them guns, so they found some used rifles they got from, I think, Czechoslovakia, and brought them in under cover of darkness and hid them. They were ready. Everything was poised to see what would happen. The UN recognized it. It went to the Israeli cabinet, and they met in Tel Aviv and voted to, yes, we will take it. We will be a country. Within 10 minutes, Harry Truman phoned them and said, congratulations to your new country, which was a big thing. At the same time, in Washington, D.C., a Jewish organization had written up a document for him to sign. I have a copy of here. I have a copy of it right here. That is actually a statement out of their Declaration of Independence. They have that all ready to go over there. And I'll read this to you. This government, meaning the U.S. government, has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by the government thereof. And the courier bringing this over to Truman made some changes on the way. Really interesting. Provisional government thereof. The United States recognizes the provisional government as a deep authority new Jewish state, and wrote State of Israel. So that when Truman signed it, and he was signing to start the State of
I
Israel.
always thought Truman was the one who made those corrections, but it was a courier?
It was made by the courier, I understand, bringing it over.
Okay.
And Truman signed out. There's interesting things here. This is one of the most important documents of all time, really, historically, and we as Bible students recognize how important this step was. It's not even on an official letterhead. It's just a piece of paper. It wasn't, the corrections were made by hand and left that way, and there it is, signed and sealed by the President of the United States. It's just an amazing set of events that brought about the state of Israel. Okay, as soon as this happened, the British, and this is the British general that was in charge of the army there. They all got in their boats and left. I put this in there. It's almost humorous if you didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. But you're on your own. So on. And they pulled out completely. All of a sudden, Israel was
by himself.
torn. Now, all this that I'm talking about happened within minutes and hours.
Within a day.
Within a day, the British were gone. Their protection was gone. They were on their own. They were surrounded by hostile countries. And the British pulled out, left them completely on their own. Here is the map of exactly what happened. Here is the partition plan on the right. We go from right to left in Israel now. This was the country of Israel, the dark brown. This was given to the Arabs. This part then was considered part of Jordan. It was under the Jordanian control. This part down here was considered part of Egypt and was left under Egypt control. Immediately, the Arab countries, I think it was 4 hours, Mike, if I understand right, from the time that Truman phoned and said, "We recognize this," until they attacked. They were ready. They were planning all the time. Their saying was, "We want to kill the baby as soon as it's born. We want to push all the Jews into the sea." And they did, except that through a series of miraculous events, the Jews actually end up with more land than they had. So after the 1948 war, they call it the War of Independence, this is what Israel looked like. And this is basically where they are today. There were some changes in 67, and talk about that too in just a second. But this then was part of Jordan. This was Israel. That you can see the borders across there. This right here is 11 miles.
A matter of seconds for any type of combat.
Oh, yeah. No, still, even today, not defensible militarily, except that
God's in charge.
God is in the whole thing. Yeah.
I was wondering why they never took that whole strip.
You mean just what?
Yeah, I just always wondered why they just didn't take it. I mean, they had the opportunity.
Well, okay, they actually did.
I know, but they gave it back.
Okay, this was 1948 War of Independence. In 1967, 19 years later, was what we refer to the 6-Day War that Israel won. In the 6-Day War, the Arab countries were amassing at the border here, again with the idea of pushing Israel into the sea. Israel did a counterattack, completely outnumbered, completely outgunned. They only had about one airplane they borrowed from somebody. I mean, it was just not. And in 6 days, they defeated all 5 countries. Okay, so that even at the time, people recognized God was in that. 6 days and the rest of 7. And at the end of that, then, Israel did take the Gaza Strip down here, and did take the Sinai Peninsula, which was a big chunk of Egypt. They had it. They had it. Egyptian tanks were scattered all over this desert. There's some of them still there today, I think. In 1967, then, Israel had control of basically at least 85 to 90% of what King David had. so that they had regained control over their country. Now the 1948 war, as soon as they established themselves, that was the first time in over 2,000 years that the land had been in Jewish control with the Jewish government. In 57 A.D., or B.C., excuse me, when the Babylonians carried off the tribe of Judah, 587, the nation of Israel ceased to exist. Most of us in here, 1948 was in our lifetime.
Yep.
We saw a tremendous miracle and a tremendous event that has a lot of significance, not only historically, not only politically, but biblically. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about is Jerusalem. The capital, we call the capital of Israel, and has been recognized by the United States lately as being the capital of Israel. We've moved our embassy there. This plan that the UN came up with left Israel in kind of a no man's land right here in the middle, to be governed by both the Jews and the Arabs. In 1967, they pushed through and occupied right here all of Israel, including the most sacred thing in there, which is the Temple Mount, where Solomon's temple was and where Herod's temple was in Jesus' day. There's a very famous radio broadcast. A paratrooper landed on top of the dome, took off the Muslim signature that is up there, and planted an Israeli flag on top of the dome. Okay, and he radioed back that the Temple Mount is in our hands. And it was. And the Arabs were getting ready to go and packing their bags and so on. And the Israelis decided at that time that rather than upset the Arabs, we'll give it back to them. And so that's what happened. Right now, the old city of Jerusalem is divided into four parts: Armenian, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. But the Temple Mount is governed and cared for by a Jordanian group called the WAC. And they make the rules. The interesting thing is the Israeli police enforce the rules for them. And one of the rules is that nobody's allowed to pray on the Temple Mount except the Muslims. And they will arrest anybody. See here, let me get caught up with what I'm talking about. There is the Temple Mount. The side of the Temple Mount is the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, which is the only really sacred place that the Jews have in Jerusalem, in their own capital. So they come and they pray at the foot of the wall that supports the Muslim shrine up here. This is the Muslim shrine. Really, really sad. Okay, here is a little larger map which shows then the modern divisions. Here again, this is Israel. This is the West Bank, which the Palestinians call occupied territory. Gaza has been occupied by the Israelis. Now, this land that they captured in the '67 war, they returned to the Egyptians in return for peace treaty. And that peace treaty has held. Egypt has, since this was all done, Egypt has kept the peace and even cooperated. Right here in the Sinai is where some of the terrorist groups are setting up shop with rockets pointed at Israel. But for the most part, they're at peace with Egypt anyway. The other thing that is controversial is the Golan Heights, which has been in the news a lot. The Golan Heights was Syria, with the river here being the division between Syria and Golan Heights. So Israel took it in '67 and claimed it, and in 1981, actually, Israel annexed it and said this is part of the nation of Israel, and they included it in their nation. Well, nobody else in the world, not even the United States, except for Donald Trump, I guess, has recognized Israel's claim. So that's called occupied territory by the United Nations. This is occupied territory, belongs to someone else, but Israel is occupying it. This is Egyptian land. There, Israel has released all claim to that. So this is then just the same map with everything blanked out. This is the country of Israel today. This is where the borders are. The West Bank, which contains a lot of ex-Jordanian citizens, because Jordan had to pull out in the war. And Israel is claiming it and so on. There's been several proposals for peace agreements and so on. Now, one of the things I said, that the rules they have on the Temple Mount was that nobody can pray there except the Arabs, the Muslims. Okay, if you go up there, there are actually Israeli police enforcing that, going around and looking for people with their eyes closed. And there's a picture of one that's actually happened, has happened many times. You can see that. This old gentleman, the Jew, walking around with his eyes closed on the Temple Mount, and these are Israeli police carrying him away. So, actually, I have a few scriptures to tie into this, but we'll probably have to close off as the time is up. Are there any comments or questions on this? You understand why it is kind of a mess for the whole world, what is going on there?
So prophecy-wise, where does that leave us right now, as far as?
Well, prophecy-wise, the biggest thing was, I think, when Israel became a nation. Because then all these things we've been talking about in the book of Revelation can come to pass. They have their land back. Their people have amassed in there, and they can go ahead and fulfill what's in the book of Revelation. God has brought all his Jews in there so he can judge them. And when he judges the country, he judges the world. I think that's big. And prophecy-wise, those Arab countries are all shooting at them off now and then, and there's a very good chance of war breaking out any time, which would fit right into what we've been studying. Absolutely. Okay, let's close. Our Heavenly Father, We thank you that you have given us a picture of your nation, Israel, in the Bible, and you're dealing with the human situation. We thank you that you have been faithful to your people Israel over the centuries, even though they were unfaithful to you. This gives us confidence in our relationship with Jesus Christ. Just pray for the nation of Israel. Pray for their safety. Pray for their salvation. And Lord, we pray that you'd help us to stay faithful in these last days. And we thank you that you've given us a hint as to what is happening, that we can be ready when you come. We pray in Jesus' name.